Welcome to this NICEC network meeting on decent work and career development. I'm Michael Labalestia, one of the NICEC fellows, and today we're going to be exploring the value of the decent work policy agenda for career development, scholarship and practice. Now, during the event, there are going to be 2 breakout sessions. So if you're watching this as a recording, you won't see those breakouts, but you will see the following discussion in the plenary sessions. So I'm delighted today that we're joined by 4 expert presenters who are going to share with you some of their thinking and research. We have Fiona Christie, Christina Purcell, Eileen Cunningham and Pete Robertson. So I will hand over now to Fiona Christie.
Thank you, Michael. Hopefully you can all see my slide to welcome you to this NICEC network meeting, which we've called Decent Work and Career Development. This meeting was conceived as a partnership really between NICEC, because I'm a NICEC fellow, but I also work as a researcher in the Decent Work and Productivity Research Centre at Manchester Met. So hence my slide, beginning slide here. This event is part of a regular series of events that NICEC organised, and it was planned before COVID-19. So we managed to successfully move it online. So thank you very much to Michael for making that happen. NICEC, for those of you who do not know, it's a learned society of scholars and practitioners in the field of career guidance with a strong partnership to other membership organisations such as CDI. Just to give you a bit of a time frame for the afternoon, you'll see the 4 speakers, which Michael's already mentioned. We're all going to be talking sort of quite briefly about our topics. The event today was originally born out of the current edition of the NICEC journal, which I guest edited with Eileen Cunningham and Kath Houston. So this event piggybacks on that, although Pete Robertson is the only one of the speakers who actually wrote a full article for that journal. Myself and Christina Purcell, we both work in the Decent Work and Productivity Research Centre at Manchester Met. My background is as a career development practitioner, but I have moved into a research role. Christina is an academic in the department working with me who researches employment. Eileen and Pete are also former career development practitioners who are now academics working in different roles. Today we have a range of topics, all of which relate in some way to decent work and career development policy and practice. And we are aware that some of what we are talking about, which we planned previously, will have been amplified by the COVID-19 emergency. As Michael said, we are experimenting with the format of the event and allowed space for breakouts and Q&A, and we're deliberately keeping the inputs from speakers short, as we know that listening for an extended period can be quite intense for you as listeners. We will welcome feedback on this afterwards. So just to remind you about the journal, here is the journal that I was just mentioning. You won't be able to see the detail of the font there. This is due out digitally imminently. CDI members will have access to it. If you want to know more and we're watching this and you're not a NICEC member, please do get in touch. It's physically and digitally published twice a year. Okay, so if I pause now on my general introduction to the whole session and move on to my short talk, which I've titled, What is Decent Work and Why Should It Matter for Career Guidance? So my plan is to talk briefly about decent work and what it is, because I think some people may not be so aware of it, and apologies to those who may know a lot about it already, and then also think about what the implications for career guidance are. For those of you who don't know, decent work and economic growth combine together to be one of the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals. And I wanted to address this as interesting. Since I moved into a role working in the research centre, I faced some interesting reactions from careers practitioners when I mentioned decent work. Some people have reacted to the word decent, thinking, well, is that just about something that is just good enough? We're encouraging people to think about work that's just good enough, while others in higher education context have said to me, oh, well, do you think the idea of decent work is actually aspirational enough for students in universities. These sort of questions that I've faced made me think this was worthy of a discussion, to think about how this concept could be useful for career development practitioners. Okay, just to be clear about the United Nations sustainability goals there, you can see there the 17 goals, and you can see at number 8, decent work and economic growth. It is paired with economic growth because there's a strong evidence base to show that actually good quality work, decent work, actually is better for the economy than kind of poor quality work. So to give you a bit of background, I think it was a couple of decades ago that the International Labour Organization originally conceived of the aspirations for decent work, and there have been 4 foundations and aspirations that have underpinned the direction of travel, which are listed on the slide. So firstly, promoting employment and creating sustainable institutional economic environment for work for individuals across the globe. Having measures of social protection to support people in work, but also when they are unemployed as well. Thirdly, having a culture of social dialogue between employers, between trade unions, and so on. And finally, having systems in place to respect, promote, and realise the principles of rights at work. Could be about equality, it could be about fair income, and so on. So these have been the 4 kind of aspirations which were conceived of as a sort of global aspirations, really. Certainly for me, though, even though obviously what decent work might be in the UK might be quite different from sub-Saharan Africa, but when I look at some of these principles, they certainly do resonate with the UK context in which I work. And I think some of these issues in our global context, where there's so much happening in terms of work, for example, in terms of trends, how technology is changing work, the growth of inequalities in the labour market, fears about the halting of intergenerational mobility, economic uncertainty, political uncertainties. I think some of these principles are useful ones to make us stop and think about how we want work to be in our society and how career development professionals function within that context. Okay, so fast forward 2 decades, actually, and in 2018, the ILO produced a new report revisiting these sort of topics called Working for a Better Future. I've actually taken this diagram from a presentation that Damien Grimshaw, who's head of research at the ILO, did at our research centre launch back in 2019, because I think it captures nicely the 4 principles I just the 4 foundations I just told you about visually. So the 4 foundations, which are about access to work, rights at work, social protection, social dialogue, but then framed nicely by these principles about work, people having dignity at work, having equality, having a fair income, having safe working conditions, and also having voice, really. So I think that's I borrowed that from Damien's presentation, because I think it's always good to have a visual, really. Straight away I would observe about this diagram that and the previous slide, that I think some of the critique of decent work has been around the role of voice and worker voice, because there has been an emphasis, I think, on the role of trade unions as representative worker organisations in relation to voice. And this does raise questions for the many workers who are not in a trade union, and actually how that principle of kind of worker voice can be enacted in those different kind of worker contexts. So that's kind of an interesting question for us to consider. Okay, so I mentioned this 2018 report, Work for a Better Future. So this was part of this, came out of the Global Commission on the Future of Work, and I think there was a very strong approach with this report. They talked about human-centered agenda for the future of work, and their approach was very much about keeping humans, so that's you and me, that's us, at the heart of how work develops. I think this is an important thing to have done, because I think much of the discussion about work is about how technology is advancing so fast, and we as humans just need to fit in with what the market, what technology is directing us in terms of work. However, this report very clearly sort of stressed that the future of work should have at its heart what human beings need to flourish and survive and determine themselves going forwards. They actually highlighted 3 things that needed to be done to develop decent work, and it was about investing in people's capabilities, investing in the institutions of work, and investing in decent and sustainable work. So 3 broad areas for activity to help decent work happen. And actually, I mean, I've summarised the ILO recommendations here. So the first section is about investing in people's capabilities. The second section is about institutions of work, so i.e. employers, trade unions. And finally, investment in decent and sustainable work. So that's about how our economies, how our governments put structures in place to ensure that there is work for people. I guess I'd like to highlight here, which I think is most appropriate for careers guidance, really, is the one under people's capabilities, because the recommendations were about a universal entitlement to lifelong learning, supporting people through future work transitions, and so on. And actually, I think those are the kind of things that career development professionals have been involved in, and is at the heart of their work for as long as I've been working in this field. So I think it's really interesting that the ILO make those recommendations in their report, and I'm sure that all of us would agree with those. They don't specify, obviously they're a global organisation, they don't specify how some of these things are going to happen, however that those recommendations are made, really. Okay, and just to sort of move on, really, that obviously there's been these global aspirations that the ILO have led upon. Many countries across the globe have responded to this agenda that's been going on for some time. And on this slide, I've just identified 3 examples of responses within the UK, where I'm based, that have picked up on this broad direction of travel around decent work. The UK government under Theresa May back in 2016 commissioned Matthew Taylor and the RSA to do a review of good work. So that was published back in 2017. There's been subsequent kind of work done about how we might measure good quality work. The CIPD has written a report about good work. In my view, often good work and decent work quite often can be used a little bit synonymously in this context. And actually, I think these 3 examples were very much looking at how we can make good quality work environments for people in the UK. Interestingly, certainly the Taylor Review came up with lots of interesting recommendations about how we approach people like this, what they call the pseudo self-employed, or dependent contractors, which are the evolving workers in the gig economy, to help protect their position. Even though the UK government has picked up on some of the recommendations and has shown a sort of positive response to some of the recommendations for improving work, that certainly the Taylor Review highlighted a couple of years ago. And they've talked about having a government good work plan. How this has developed has been very slow, partly because certainly the UK government has had their attention occupied with other things politically, for example, Brexit. Okay, I think for career development professionals, this diagram here, I think, is a useful reminder. This comes from David Bluestein's very recent book, where he's interested in decent work and has reflected upon this in his work. And actually, he's reminded us very usefully how contemporary work contexts have a number of different aspects. So in this diagram, he's talked about how there's decent work with purpose and meaning, there's precarious work, there's unemployment, there's underemployment. And actually, he's sort of highlighted that actually for many people in the world today, their work at different times of their life may be one of these categories, really. And actually that's something that career development practitioners need to be able to support clients with, to realize that sometimes people may be unemployed, they may be underemployed, they may have a decent work, or and that decent work may or may not have purpose and meaning. But I think David Bluestone usefully highlights this, the different features of work and how we as career development practitioners support clients to kind of understand the fluidity of some of these categories and to work out how they navigate these different types of work. I think this is useful. I think it also highlights potentially that people could be in precarious work, but actually not have decent work in terms of maybe security of income or whatever. However, that precarious work may also give them purpose and meaning. So I think it's interesting to think about these different categories of people's working lives, and I think that's important for us working with individuals and organisations to be aware of that and to talk to our clients about these things. Okay, I think COVID-19, I wanted to sort of mention this actually, because sometimes thinking about decent work allows us to, and the principles that I've outlined, allow us to think about some of the features and the issues that have emerged as in the current crisis. So, I mean, for example, here I've got a couple of screenshot pictures of the lovely Banksy picture that is now up in a Southampton hospital, which shows the little boy throwing away his Superman and hero toys and picking up a nurse as his hero he wants to play with. So Banksy there has captured that notion of health workers being heroes, and that's been an interesting discourse that's emerged as a result of the crisis. However, the second screenshot on this slide is an opinion piece from a doctor, which is saying, forget medals and fly paths, what we want is proper pay and PPE. And I think it's very interesting that obviously COVID-19 has highlighted really important issues related to decent work in terms of the safety of the health workers in particular, that actually their safe working conditions have actually been compromised in a way that we've not really seen before, and obviously the principle and the foundation of decent work is that people should have safe working conditions. So that's an interesting observation there to think about in relation to decent work. And then secondly, and actually, well, I've got two screenshots here, and I've taken these from research that colleagues at Manchester Met in the Research Centre have been doing, who are very interested in the position of self-employed workers, and they've been arguing for some time that self-employed workers, that the infrastructure that supports them could be stronger, and even things like how we approach enterprise education needs to be rethought. So colleagues here at my university contributed a couple of news stories which I've screenshotted the headlines from there, highlighting issues around social protection for self-employed workers. Social protection is a foundation of decent work, and actually I think the current crisis has actually shown how self-employed workers have been particularly vulnerable to the economic impact of COVID-19, and actually maybe sort of kind of highlighting that sort of problems that sometimes self-employment, and I think career practitioners sometimes might sort of do this, will actually sort of present self-employment as some sort of great way of working where you've got autonomy and choice and freedom and things like that. However, there could be problems really in terms of kind of what social protection and safety nets are when income streams fall away, as we've seen in the current crisis. Okay, so moving on. Yes, so this is my final slide really, to sort of highlight maybe some of the issues which I've been mentioning already in relation to career guidance, so our field. So if I just sort of briefly mention these, I do think that the principles of decent work do align with social justice and career guidance agenda, in the sense of the aim of supporting the option of meaningful work for all, and individuals working together to make work better for themselves rather than working in isolation. So that would be my view, really. Sort of moving on, I think as well it's interesting, the ILO decent work recommendations, which include support for work transitions and lifelong learning. I would argue that actually it would be a good thing in terms of the decent work agenda to actually have that notion of access to advice and guidance to be about careers, about work, to be a universal right, and to have an infrastructure to make that happen. At the moment, we don't have that. Certainly in the UK, there may be other countries in the globe that do have it. A third issue I've highlighted there is a risk that careers practitioners may unwittingly support the erosion of decent work by uncritically advocating modes of work that are insecure, exploitative. And I think it raises ethical considerations for practitioners in terms of how they manage and advise individuals in new work forms that may be, insecure, really. So that's something to consider. I think the fourth point there I put down is about what our purpose is as careers practitioners, to support individuals in competing with one another, or is it to help support clients to think more critically, also to think cooperatively how they may work with others in actually developing their future work lives. And finally, I do think that decent work concepts can actually usefully frame discussions about work, especially in curriculum-based work that practitioners may be involved in, especially maybe in educational institutions. So, and I think that can help support what certainly a number of writers have talked about around critical consciousness, and actually helping people to think about systemic issues in society which may impact on their working lives in a helpful way. And that's certainly something that sort of Bluestein has highlighted in his work, which I would agree with. So so a few sort of questions for us as practitioners there. Okay, that's my final slide. Thank you very much for listening. And my contact details there. Do get in touch with any questions. And finally, in good presenter style, I have actually included in this talk some references if there's anything that you would like to follow up from what I've spoken about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for sharing those insights. That was really interesting, and that I can see there's been quite a lot of discussion in the chat. Obviously, you've raised some particular questions as well, which we might consider in relation to career guidance practice. And what I'm asking people to do is to hold on to those thoughts for our breakout sessions, which will be coming up in about a quarter of an hour. And also there'll be an opportunity to post any questions you've got to our presenters after those breakout sessions. But do use the chat as we're going through. Christina, I'll hand over to you to share your screen.
All right, so I'm just about to share now. Yeah, okay. Right, so I'm just seeing, I can't see all my slides there, just move that. Okay, right. Hello everybody. As Fiona said, I'm a researcher. I work with Fiona at Manchester University, and we've been doing some a small sort of scoping research project which began last summer, and I'm going to present some findings from that, just some very preliminary findings. It's ongoing. I did some, in fact, I did some interviews just last week for this project. Now, it's called Escaping the Boss, and that kind of that encapsulates what I'm going to focus on, I think, in the findings that I'm going to present. And I thought it was really interesting. I liked Fiona's slide. You had a slide which talked about the generation of entrepreneurs who might be missing out on support. And underneath the slide was a delivery rider. Is a delivery rider an entrepreneur? Do they think of themselves as entrepreneurs? And this is kind of one of the things we were really looking at as well as other aspects of their work. So just to, whoops, something's gone wrong there. Yeah, I'm back in now. Yeah, so just I'm going to give it first give a bit of contextual background to the project, why we decided to do this project, and quickly look at the research questions and methods. And then I'm going to, most of this presentation will be just showing some of the data. So it's raw data. It's not. It's no. We haven't analysed it to any great extent. We're just at the start of that process, and then finish with the implications. So just a bit of context. In the Northwest in general, but also in Manchester, there is an increasing prevalence of insecure work, and what might be considered work that isn't decent precisely because of its lack of security. So we have a figure there, 7% of all workers in Manchester are in non-secure jobs. Now, that might not seem to be a lot. However, I think we need to take into account a number of things. One, it's growing. So we can see this research that was carried out by the TUC found that, new jobs that were created between 2011 and 2016, 47% of those were insecure, and those kind of jobs will be a whole range of insecure contracts ranging from agency work, but in a particular growth in what we might call bogus self-employment, gig economy, those kind of jobs. And in particular, I'm sure you're all aware about what we've had is the growth of what we might call platform-mediated gig economy. I've just included a definition there of the gig economy. There isn't any sort of consensus about what the gig economy here is, but this definition comes from a report carried out, which was commissioned by the government in 2016, and it actually talks about it being gig economy being the exchange of labour for money between individuals or companies via digital platforms, and it's the platforms that facilitate the matching between providers and customers. So that's one way of looking at the gig economy, and lots of it's a very common way of looking at the gig economy. But I think we need to recognise that the gig economy isn't just that beyond digital platforms, there is a whole range of activities that aren't really captured if we just focus on the digital platforms. But I think the digital platforms have a lot of interest has been on the digital platforms precisely because of the extremely rapid growth. The fact that it does facilitate, the technology facilitates the growth of very, very insecure casualised work, which for some people is seen to be allow them to access employment and access the labour market very, very quickly in a way that they may not have been able to do before, say, for example, via an agency, a temporary work agency. So we're interested in it because it's an issue, and because in particular it's young delivery workers young workers are increasingly accessing work via this platform. So I had a figure somewhere that about 6 out of 10 platform workers are aged between 16 to 34. So it's an important development that is affecting young people and their access and their transition to the labour market in particular. So, and as you're probably aware, there's been a lot of controversy over this form of work. Is it employment? Is it are you an independent contractor? Are you self-employed? Obviously, there's very different types of platform work, and the platforms themselves will promote themselves as being, neutral intermediaries that offers flexibility and freedom. And often you'll see them playing with this idea of being your own boss. So Stuart, which you may not be familiar with, it's not one of the most out there. It's not as familiar as Deliveroo. And similarly with Uber, they will talk about being your own boss, flexibility to work when you want to, etc., etc.
Christina, can I just interrupt you very briefly? George mentioned quite an interesting point. He asked, is there a difference between non-secure and insecure? I just wondered on your take on that.
Non-secure and insecure. I'm not really sure. I haven't really thought about that. We tend to use the term insecure work. It's quite the nuance between the two. I'd be interested to know why George asked that and what his take would be.
Perhaps that's one for our breakout groups later,
yeah.
And we'll get some feedback afterwards.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so I'm going to focus on why young people, so what I'm going to present is why young people work in delivery jobs. That's what I'm going to look at. Just briefly on our methodology, because it is important. It's qualitative. We held a focus group, and also we've had interviews, one-to-one interviews, and it's not scientific sampling. It's snowball sampling. They're a hard to reach group of people, food delivery riders. And our participants so far, so it's small, it's a scoping study, remember, 8 riders, all male, in their 20s. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to present, so basically it's just going to be presenting the data and putting it out there with perhaps a bit of my interpretation. You might interpret it differently. So the job, and this sort of it brings us on to why they do this job. So it's one aspect of why they do this job. So this data is quite interesting, I think. Bear in mind, this is a really small sample, if you think we've as well. So this is from both interviews and focus group. I like this job. I like spending time outside. I really like it. The work itself I really enjoy. It's enjoyable, keeps me fit, good way of exploring the city. It's fun. Sounds great, doesn't it? Sort of very much in contrast with what we hear about this kind of work in the media, perhaps. But I think it's important, and that seems really, really positive. So you can see very, very clearly, very quickly, why they're doing this kind of job. They like it, so it seems obvious. And that goes back to what we might say about decent work and purpose and meaning. If you like a job, you're really enjoying it. That gives you some sort of purpose and meaning in your job to some extent, I would imagine. However, I think if you look a bit more closely at some of the wording, some of the words that are actually being used, that some of those, not all of them, I think, but certainly if you think about the actual job, there's something else going on there. I enjoy the job itself, the work itself. So that gives you a bit more nuance. And it's only, one of them says, I like this job. I like this job. Others are saying, I like the actual job, the job itself. And in fact, when some of our participants were talking in this positive way, it was also in the context of negative aspects of the job, which we can see here. So for some of those, 3 of those quotes, which talked about liking the job, also talked about stress and frustration. So you have one, the stress that comes from a restaurant messing you around. So you've got a long wait. So remember, they don't get paid for their time, they get paid per delivery. So that really has an impact. Frustration from not getting the hours you want, that instability of income, and also the changes. And that's something I won't talk about in any detail, but the fact that the algorithm, the app changes constantly. If you think about the problems that we have trying to get on top of the technology that we've had to do recently, these workers were having to do this and are having to do this on a continual basis as the platforms are constantly changing and changing the goalposts in terms of the app and how frustrating that is for them. So, other aspects. Freedom, really important as well. Sorry, I'm just pulling up the chat so I know when I'm going to be told to stop. I like the freedom of the job. We don't have a boss. We don't have anyone to tell us when to be in. I'm not contracted 20 hours. Again, the flexibility and freedom. You are your own boss. And these responses very much chime in with what the platforms, how they sell work and what they tell us the work. They are providing freedom, flexibility. You can be your own boss. Whether that's the same as entrepreneurship, it's not as if you can grow your business, so to speak, as a delivery worker. But those ideas seem to be very strong. And this chimes in with lots of the research that I've read from around the world, where despite all the negative aspects of that job, that idea of being free, having your own freedom, not having a boss, being your own boss is a really, really important pull in this type of work, and certainly for the young men that we spoke to. And I think that's really interesting, and that tells us something about what certainly the young generation, and I think many of us want from work really. But I also think, we have to see that in another context, and that is in terms of people's experience of more traditional forms of employment. So if we think about the reasons that they're in this job, many of them talked about other jobs they'd had. So talked about jobs in retail. I'd rather do this than work in retail, hospitality. If you think about the kind of jobs that many of these young people might be going into, they're comparing them. These young men were comparing them with these jobs, and definitely being any kind of delivery, food delivery rider, was really important in terms of, it was comparing with those jobs. So I thought one of these quotes is really interesting, in that the idea that in retail job, for example, you have a flat rate, but within being a platform rider, so long as you put in the work and you could earn more. So what you get and what you get paid is in relation to how hard you graft, how long you ride, how many deliveries you do. So it's this idea that you've got some kind of control as well over your reward in terms of how hard you work. And I thought that was a really interesting quote that came out from one of the riders, and you get a sense of this here. So the idea of control over your working life. So this is rather a long quote, but I think it's worth it. So it's basically saying, it's really important as well, it's the most easily accessible, highest paid job. So it's easily accessible, really easy to start up, to get into, and some of the riders I spoke to last week were saying, they got into it. One of them rather was saying that he got into it through a friend, and it was really easy to get into. So although you might be in a retail job earning £7 or £8 an hour, your contract might be only a 7-hour contract, and you have no guarantee, you have no control over that. Whereas if you're working for a platform, you can work as long as you want. So if you want to earn lots of hours and earn lots of money, or reasonable money, you can. And if you keep your statistics up, that means you're allowed to have access. You're doing a good job, and you're allowed to have access to more hours. And so I thought that was quite interesting in terms of. So it's not so much the freedom, the flexibility. It's also this sense that you could actually control what you got out of that job in a way that you wouldn't be able to in a traditional employment relationship. And I think this interview data is quite interesting from that point of view, and it gives us a different side. However, how many minutes do I have?
Sorry, we've actually run out of time. If you want to just quickly wrap up this last slide, that would be great.
Right. I couldn't see your. That was my last slide. Everything I've presented is quite positive, because I'm interested in that side in terms of that what draws them to that job in terms of the freedom and flexibility and being their own boss. However, there are many negative aspects of the job which sort of chime in with some of the things that Fiona was saying about decent work, and particularly the inconsistencies, instability, and that came out particularly in the focus groups. So all those positive things that I've just talked about, we need to, it's in context in terms of comparison with other jobs, but also the negative sides. But it seems to be that despite those negative sides, that pull of flexibility and the idea of freedom seems to be very, very, very strong. Implications. Can workers have both freedom and economic security, I think, is a question I want to ask. That's the end. Sorry I went over time. It's just
no problem.
I have the chat up, but I can't see. I haven't got the latest.
Thank you very much, Christina.
Stop sharing now.
If you could stop sharing, that would be great. So there's been some very interesting exchanges going on in the chat area, and what I'd encourage people to do is to hold those thoughts and take those now into the discussion groups.
What was decent for one person wasn't for another person. So we were kind of gobsmacked by the complexity. That's it.
Thank you, Lynn. So that complexity issue was really what struck you all. That's great to hear. And we're coming now to Alexandra. So I'll unmute you, Alexandra.
Yeah, very similar actually in our little group as well. The complexities were around what would matter to different people will perhaps vary over time, but not just, I mean, in the study we were talking about, obviously that was younger workers, and it may vary over time, but also it could just be a stage of life thing. But then also in certain sectors, there's more of it's not really a push, more of a convention of working in particular ways, a tradition of freelance, which may be a direct choice, but has its disadvantages, especially at a time like this. And we've started off thinking about, you know, the accessibility of the kind of job of a delivery driver. That's not always going to be true for people who have this precarity. You can be in an extremely skilled job and quite established in your career, but if you're a freelancer and the work just dries up, anybody can be hit in that way. So we couldn't even find things that would be kind of universal markers of how come or why a person might find themselves in this situation. But certainly we also agreed it totally depends on your perspective at the time. What one person thinks is totally decent and works for them, the next person would find entirely unacceptable.
Thank you. Thank you. Who else would like to comment? Would anyone else like to share what they saw in their group? I see some interesting things coming through in the comments panel. Ree, how about you?
If you unmute me, I think we hit the button at the same time. Yes, in our group we talked about the definition between, the difference between good work as something that's a personal sort of experience, and then the ILO definition of decent work, which I have put in the chat, where there are actually some markers that are not individually experienced, but are more markers of a decent work, which is kind of universal, because these markers are related to the local socio-economical circumstances of a country and a culture. And I think that it's important not to individualize decent work to, you know, the individual experience of whether something is decent or not in my life, but actually there are common markers that we can look at and discuss.
Thank you very much. Anyone else want to say what their group talked about? Did anyone talk about sort of different angles, perhaps, to those that we've talked about so far?
Michael, I'm going to jump in there actually.
Okay, Fiona, do.
I've got the power as host to unmute. I realise I can unmute myself.
Then we have Ronald waiting as well. So
yeah, I'll just sort of jump in that I do think that certainly in the UK, people talk about good work, and certainly the work that Matthew Taylor's done, they're using good work and decent work synonymously in a way, actually. And also, I do agree with you, Ree, that I think, and actually I disagree with Lynn to a certain extent, that actually if we just go so much about, yes, it's all a bit subjective and people have got different subjective views of what good work is or decent work is, then that sometimes can let people off the hook. So yes, our delivery drivers might not mind that actually they've got to go and buy the hand sanitizer. You know, Deliveroo doesn't buy them the hand sanitizer. They're given the money to go and buy it themselves. So, you know, that's got kind of implications for us all, actually, if an employer isn't actually kind of framing or putting a support system in place to keep their workers safe. So I do think there are some things that, which is why I think the ILO work is very valuable, actually, in terms of some reasonably objective notions about what is good and what is decent.
Thanks, Fiona. Ronald, can we come to you? I'll just unmute you there. There we are.
Okay, so one idea I wanted to bring to the table is the political work that the term decent work does actually. That is, by using the term decent work, one can promote and aspire to forms of life where we are productive, but also being creative and having access to what can be termed the goodies of life. So while the term decent work can have that politically positive effect, there are some critics of decent work as a notion, which I think we should bring into the conversation. And what they're saying is that the term decent work basically functions to flank neoliberalism, that it basically keeps us within the paradigm of neoliberal forms of producing and distributing wealth, but does not really challenge the paradigm in which we operate. And that therefore it might have it might work against the kinds of aspirations we see in more radical imaginaries of work, like cooperatives, worker directives, communities which are very much trying to think of the world in a different way, producing wealth and sharing it in different ways. So while decent work might sound very progressive, some are arguing that actually it serves to keep the status quo, simply bringing in progressive ideas which ultimately serve to disenfranchise other more radical ideas which also respond to the climate crisis, for example, the climate emergency. So just an idea that we mustn't think of decent work as simply something great. It might actually be ideologically doing work which is counter our progressive aspirations.
Thank you very much for that input, Ronald. And I'm sure that's something we'll want to pick up further with our presenters in the next two sessions, but also in our later discussion group as well. So Serena, you've got your hand up, so please go ahead.
I resonated very much with Fiona's comments around the role of careers professionals, perhaps unwittingly, contributing to issues around decent work. And certainly in Canada, there's tremendous pressure on those working in the public employment systems. There are systemic, it is built into our systems that people are paid based on the number of people that get employed. And so there's very little space to actually critically assess with those that we're serving the decency of the work for them, you know, whether there's the instinct is to knee-jerk into the first available job because that's how people get paid. And so I think it really raises questions around our role as a field in terms of being voices for issues at the systems level that may be really contributing to inequalities and challenges around people accessing and being able to sustain in a decent work environment. And then the other issue that we chatted about in our group was whether the COVID-19 situation is actually an opportunity for a bit of realignment around what kinds of jobs we value and hold up in our society. Because, you know, so many of the essential workers were in a category that were considered low skill, low pay, and fragile, and whether that might change as a result of COVID.
Thank you very much. So some really interesting discussions clearly have been going on in your groups.
Just building on the discussion that's been going on so far, my research is about student and graduate experiences of unpaid work, which are quite often not exactly decent jobs or decent work. So less than decent work is often a feature of early graduates' careers through internships or volunteering or other kind of forms of work experience. And what I felt is that we can't really just take the moral high ground on decent work based on our own judgments. As professionals in society, we need to help young people to find a way through it into decent work, hopefully. So I'm going to share just the findings. I'm not going to talk about the research itself, but if you want to know more about that, you can ask, or I can share the slides which have got more information. But 4 overall observations. The first was that the world of work for young people is often a real shock, but not in the ways that we might expect and prepare them for beforehand. Secondly, a willingness to accept less than decent work as a short-term compromise for longer-term gain seemed to be a successful strategy for many. Other people were highly significant in helping young people through, helping them to navigate and negotiate this journey. And finally, sheer persistence seemed to contribute very well to successful outcomes. So I'd like to share with you the words of some of the participants. You may notice from these photos that they're actually famous people, not my real participants, but the pictures that just reminded me of these 3 people. So the first one is Kayla, who volunteered at a wildlife reserve. She was underemployed in a care home on graduating for a long, long time, and now she's a senior environmental advisor. So here, had a paid-for international internship. He worked voluntarily for a local charity, and now he's doing really well working in Switzerland on a really prestigious graduate scheme. And finally, Harriet, who had work experience at school with a GP. She fell into lots of really poor quality jobs for about a year after graduating, cleaning buses, which probably is a very undesirable job at the moment, volunteering in a local hospital cafe, and an internship with a clinical commissioning group. So I wanted to share some of their words with you. The picture that I chose shows this kind of landscape, which is a real challenge, but with the, pardon the phrase, the sunlit uplands at the end of it all. So it was quite a challenge for a lot of young people. And a quote from Kayla, I thought, and I think a lot of people thought, that they would step out of uni in their robes, straight into their suits, and they'd be off to work. I feel so passionate about people being able to know before they graduate, actually, the jobs aren't going to come to you. And Kayla was urging me to pass this message on to our students. So, as part of the interviews, lots of people, sorry, I just leaned on my space bar then. So lots of participants talked about the world in terms of shocking or bizarre or strange or crazy. This was a really strong theme coming through. And it made me wonder how much we do prepare them for this world of work. We might tell them about working patterns or what to wear, or about hierarchies or different organisations. They may look at websites, but how much do they know about psychological contracts of employment, what their expectations and how they may often not be met, and unspoken codes of conduct? All this was a complete mystery to them. This idea of strangeness also makes me think of every work email I seem to get at the moment starts off by talking about these strange circumstances. So there are definitely parallels with work experience in our COVID world. The work of Heidegger, philosopher, really made me think about how maybe we should come to expect strangeness and expect the unexpected, as this helps us to look at the world in a different way. And certainly that relates to a discussion we were just having about the opportunities of crises. A real theme that came through very strongly was how young people were prepared to sacrifice and compromise for a short period of time with the hope that in the longer term, this will pay off. So a quote from Harriet, it was boring, but it was an experience of working life. Sure, it was a year of many unsuccessful moments, but I'm really good at jobs now. I know how to work hard and I know how to please management. So this idea of delayed gratification, where they'd accept these kind of jobs, this really creates a dilemma for us as professionals, because often what we do is turn a blind eye to these exploitative, often, situations. And we certainly try not to promote them. There's a really good article in the latest NICEC journal by Helen Buzz-Duggan that talks about this and how we can best help young people through these situations. Do we just accept that they happen, or do we actively discuss ways to challenge situations that are unfair? And do we say to people, it's okay, you can put up with it for a little while and it'll get better in the long run? Or do we tell them to walk away if something doesn't work for them? There's a lot of talk about graduate resilience, but in the interviews, when I read through them and when I listened to people, what was coming through was not necessarily resilience. Many of the people I spoke to were not at all resilient. Many of them felt very, very vulnerable. Many of them were very emotional, and the number of times that people talked about stress through this period of transition into the labour market really actually made me feel quite sad for them. But this quote from Zahir, I've had so many rejections over the year. I see how many graduates there are, and I think, well, don't be surprised that you've been rejected, because there's like 1,000 people. Be surprised if you get in. That's how I think of it. So persistence, determination, self-efficacy, and tenacity, I think, were the key characteristics or behaviours that made a difference to people. Now, this is quite helpful for us as practitioners, because I think resilience is often seen as some kind of personal characteristic that's deep inside you that's going to help you it's kind of heroic and going to help you through. Whereas persistence and determination focuses on what actions people can take, what they can practically do. So if we can encourage people to keep on going, even though things do get tough. In fact, many of them felt that resilience came from these challenges, from these terrible jobs that they had to put up with. A really key part of their narrative and their stories, role of other people. So when I started my research, I was looking at the work of Bourdieu and social capital and creating networks and helping people to make links and contacts. What came through in talking to these young people was the evidence of real relationships, real connections that they'd formed that made a huge difference between failure and, I keep wanting to say indecent work. Indecent work sounds like something a bit dubious, but less than decent work if we use that term. So a quote again from Zahir, "The woman who took me on just changed me completely. It was really humbling that she had the trust in me, because when I was doing these events, I was just 18. Yeah, she's been one of the biggest influences in my life, definitely." So as practitioners, this means for us, well, actually, not one of the participants ever mentioned social capital, which I was kind of surprised about from an academic point of view, and we often talk about it. So the dilemma for us and the challenge for us is whether we openly talk about social capital and how to build it, or do we try to create more and more opportunities for real relationships that will support and nurture young people, and to open up space for meaningful conversations? Lots of participants talked about their English teacher or someone on a placement, or their parents or their aunties and uncles. Careers advisors sadly weren't mentioned so often. So just to summarise how we can rise to the challenges, and I would definitely recommend, and not just because I'm a co-editor, but I really recommend the latest journal, NICEC journal. There's some really, really powerful articles in there. So first of all, the challenge is, how do we encourage and empower rather than turn a blind eye or mollycoddle young people and just, you know, try to keep them out of work that's challenging and unfair? Secondly, and this is from Hooley and Ronald Sultana and Ree Thompson, we need to name the oppression. We need to talk about exploitation and teach them how to challenge it. And again, there's a lovely article from Anne Delazon that talks about bringing classroom activities in that help people to reflect upon the work experience and how to challenge inequality and social injustice. We need to strike a balance between optimism and realism. And a challenge for me was when Kayla said, you've got to tell people what it's like out here. It's so terrible and it's so scary. How do I take that back to a classroom without scaring the living daylights out of my students? So it's maintaining that balance of being realistic, but also saying this is how you can improve your chances. And finally, to identify, to build and to nurture real relationships, real connections between people. Thank you for listening. If you've got any questions, we may have time for a few now, or certainly in the general discussion and breakouts. And here's a list of my references if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen. And we will be sharing the presentations with people afterwards, as well as the recording of this session. We will move straight on, if you don't mind, to our next presenter. That's Pete Robertson. And so Pete, I'd invite you to get ready to share your slides. But do keep in mind any questions that you may have, you can post in the chat area, and also, of course, reflect on together with your fellow attendees in our next breakout session, which will be in about a quarter of an hour's time. And you may find yourself in a breakout room with one of the research authors cited there in Eileen's last slide. So over to you, Pete.
Thanks very much. Well, thanks for inviting me. I'm going to talk about involving trade unions in careers work, and this is one of the articles in the latest NICEC journal edition. But I must do a shout out to my fellow authors. It wasn't all me by any stretch of the imagination. There were 3 others involved. Yuka Post is one such person from the Netherlands, and Yuka is actually with us today. So say hi in the chat, Yuka, so we know you're there. And the other co-authors were Nick Cimini, who's my colleague, who's a sociologist and union leader, and James Corrie, who is a Unison branch leader. So just so you know, it's not all my ideas, it's a joint effort. Now, I'm going to just very briefly touch base with social justice as our launch pad into this topic. Then I'm going to talk about unions' involvement in guidance, unions' involvement in career education, and some of the practical problems that have to be overcome to make this work. Just trying to get my screen to move. There we are. Social justice at work, first of all. Now, there's been a lot of interest in social justice at work in our field this century. Now, we're very familiar that work's been changing because of some major global drivers. That's fairly familiar territory to us. And today's all about discussing some of the implications of that for work and career, precarity, and of course, decent work, our themes for today. But I guess that there's a big issue in that we have to think about, well, what that means for career education and guidance in practice. Now, we have got very good at having conversations about this. It's an intellectual and academic level. There's been some amazing work done, and some of the most important authors are with us this afternoon, which is great. Some really good stuff. I'm interested in maybe bringing it down to a more basic level of, well, what do we do about it? What can practitioners do to address some of these issues in their work? And the starting point for us is, well, who else is interested in this? Who else can help us? And of course, you know where I'm going with that, which is trade unions. Now, so trade unions have a historic role in promoting social justice at work. It's what they do. It goes back a very long time, looking for fair wages and secure work, looking for safe work, and of course, gender equality at work and other kinds of equality at work. And more recently, we see unions playing a key role in looking after workers in precarious positions, particularly the IWGB, but other unions as well have been fighting for the rights of workers in precarious work. So in a way, they're obvious allies because they share some of our concerns and they have lots of experience in promoting social justice. So first of all, looking at applying this to career guidance, unions have been involved in the provision of guidance in a number of countries, and several European countries, notably Denmark, notably the United Kingdom. In fact, some NICEC fellows about 25 years ago got involved with the TUC in terms of developing support for educational guidance in the workplace. And this tradition continues. The Trade Union Congress, the TUC, support union learning reps to give educational guidance in British workplaces. And so Britain's one of the countries with the most well-developed guidance provision in our workplaces. What we did in our article was highlight a couple of interesting case studies. And I want to highlight a particularly good example from that UCA's involved in, which is guidance in the workplace in the Netherlands. So in the Netherlands, there's an organization, it's not a person, there's an organization called James. It comes under a union that works across a range of different industry sectors. And it's distinctive from the TUC model in the UK because they actually employ career guidance practitioners, career guidance specialists, rather than having union reps double as educational advisors. So there's specialist staff involved. It's got some interesting features. One is that it's not limited to current employees or union members. So people in transition through work, and of course, you know, with our concerns about precarity, that's particularly important. People in transitions between jobs can use the service. They don't have to be current employees or current union members. So this is particularly valuable. And it's also not limited to educational guidance. It can encompass advice about work choices as well. Now, for some employers, that's a little controversial to get employees to be thinking about future alternative employment prospects, but this is something that James is able to get involved in. It's got a fairly broad remit, and as you can see, reaches quite a large number of clients. And there's two aspects to the support offered by James. One is individual career guidance, helping people through those transitions and the complexity of that. But there's also a more systemic kind of support available, particularly in relation to the funding of training, individual learning accounts to support the development of skills, and agreements with employers in place to support the provision of this service and to support career guidance. I see Ree's just made a comment that in Denmark's particularly involved in union career guidance work as well. So we shouldn't ignore the Danish example, although it wasn't highlighted in our article on this occasion. So what we've got in the Netherlands is a really interesting example that a union can provide specialist career guidance on a fairly broad-based basis to adult workers. So it's a very interesting and inspiring example, I think. But I don't think we should see union involvement in careers work as limited to guidance. I think we should also consider career education as well. And this is something that's less well developed. Now, young people are particularly overrepresented in precarious work. They're very often the group that is engaged in less secure, less stable work. Traditionally, we support young people to choose occupations, but increasingly we could argue that there's a need for them to choose between different kinds of employment relationship as well, and to understand the implications of those choices. For a young person, flexible work may sound very attractive because they've not yet encountered the difficulties associated with no sick pay, no support with accidents, no maternity pay, lack of employment protections, or lack of health and safety support. So there are these kind of considerations. I'm very aware that in career education, we represent the demand side of the labour market very effectively. Employers, there's loads of work been done on employers' input to career education. We have agencies to support that. We have a big literature to support that. But who represents the supply side interests? Who represents the interests of workers in the education curriculum? And obviously where I'm going with this is unions could do that, or they could help us to do that. And that's an area that's underdeveloped in our work, I think. So hence my second case study, which is rather more tenuous because it relates to a proposal rather than something that's actually happened, but it does flow on from this logic. So Unison in Skills Development Scotland have proposed the provision of a careers lesson, which they've put together to equip school leavers with an understanding of their rights in a future employment relationship and enable them to develop awareness and confidence to identify, challenge, call out and reject workplace practices that fall short of fair work principles. And they do this through providing video case studies of young people's experiences in the workplace. So very practical resources that they've got there. So hopefully that will go ahead in the autumn, but that's currently a proposal, but it does illustrate that unions are interested in this. Of course, it's not easy. It's very easy to say, it's harder to do in practice, and there are some problems to overcome. There are advocates of radicalization in education, and unions have a radical tradition, and that's difficult to reconcile with building trust and stable, enduring relationships with stakeholders like employers and schools. So there's a trust issue. There's an issue around, and this has affected many union initiatives in Europe, is around getting sustainable funding for services. Associated with that, there's a tension that unions get their money from members paying fees. So arguably their members could say those fees should be spent on us, on our services for us. So there's a tension if we look at unions providing services to wider society or going out into schools. Difficult to see how that can be reconciled, but one way in which it could potentially be reconciled is that unions have to recruit new members. That's their future of their organisation, just as employers do. Now, employers go into our schools to recruit staff, but potentially unions might find it attractive to communicate with educational institutions and to reach out to pupils and students in part for self-interest, but also to educate people to protect themselves. So that's my 12 minutes up, and that's these are my main points. We're interested in finding practical solutions to social justice issues at work. Unions are obvious allies in that process. They're potentially providers of guidance in the workplace, and James is a very interesting example of that. We haven't yet developed really good methods of involving unions in career education, and that's something we should build on. And of course, there'll be challenges in doing so. I'll stop there. Of course, I have some references for you for those who are keen here, and when we share the slides, you'll see some of that information. So that's all I much.
Thank you very much.
At that point.
Thank you very much, Pete. So we've had 4 presenters this afternoon, and starting to identify a number of different challenges and implications which you might like to now reflect on in your breakout group. So we're going to move to 10 minutes in breakout group, and then after that we will come back and you'll be able to put any final questions to our panel of presenters. So I will pause the recording now at this point. So if you have a question that you would like to ask of our presenters, please go to the participants button and raise your hand there, and I will come to you, or raise something in the comments box in the chat area as well, and we will pick that up from there. And I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are, having had that further discussion following all of our presentations this afternoon. I'm sure that has brought up various thoughts for you about some of the potential ways in which we might be approaching some of the challenges that we've identified here, and also the implications for the different types of practice that people are involved in the different sectors that you are working in. So who would like to start off and ask a question or raise a point about what you covered in your group this afternoon? Okay, if we have no hands up, then I will come to our presenters, if that's okay. Fiona, would you like to comment on what your group was discussing, or any sort of key points that might have emerged from that?
Well, I think there was 6 of us in our group, and I think there were some interesting points, especially with regard to things like unpaid work, what that means in terms of equality, because sometimes we know that these things are important, but actually certain people are more able to take up unpaid work opportunities dependent on what economic capital and resources they have behind them. So the challenge is there that basically these things are part of the normal progress that people have to do in order to develop their careers, but actually it therefore advantages certain people who are got more resources and more capitals behind them.
And Jane, I see you've mentioned that your group was talking about whether the current crisis will enable changes in the employment relationship to take place. I don't know if there's anyone in your group who might like to comment further on that, or Jane, would you like to say some more about that?
I think we were just talking about, at one stage we were talking about how the role of unions has changed. If you look back over, say, the last 20 or 30 years, particularly in the UK, it's changed hugely. And there's just a feeling that, well, it was suggested to us that one of the reasons why some of the current measures to support employees are in place is as a result of union pressure. And we wondered whether that might actually mean that the role of unions is going to change, and my phrase, the employment relationship, in other words, sort of social contract as we used to refer to it years ago, might shift as a result of COVID and all the measures that the government has had to put in, and the fact that economically, you know, we're likely to emerge from this in something of a pickle, etc., etc. Really, you know, are we on the brink of something changing? I suppose is what's in my head really. So.
Thank you, Jane.
Can I respond to that?
Yes, please, Pete, do.
I think, yes, so obviously current issues around COVID are accelerating or complicating some changes that are already going on in work. I think from the point of view of some unions, this way of talking about gosh isn't work terribly modern and different and new now is the message they hear from certain powerful employers like Uber, for example, who are saying, oh yes, this is something completely different. We're not providing a taxi service, we're providing an IT service. Whereas the employer's response is, the union's response is, there's nothing new here. We're very familiar with exploitation. It comes in many different forms and we're ready to combat it, even if it's got a shiny new face on it. So I think from a union's point of view, there's some degree of truth in the fact that there's transformation going on, but also this is same old, and it's business as usual in combating new forms of exploitation.
Thanks. Could I answer a question that's just popped up?
Christina, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's decent work will appear to be secondary. I suppose it's all really linked in scenario with global depression. I mean, it's something that, as James was saying, we were talking about unions, we were talking about the future in the current context, and I certainly think that the idea of contemporary work, the opportunities, but also the dangers that are emerging. Everything's up for grabs, in my view. I would argue. I think that there is a societal conversation going on, given how the problems of some workers. Somebody was talking about what type of work do we value. That's already out there, being discussed. The people who are keeping our infrastructure together, the social care workers and nurses, but also the delivery workers who've been out there, but also their situation has been exposed as being very precarious and lacking in any kind of safety net or security. So these questions are up there and out there, and people are having them. The danger is that the people that we have in power are very much ideologically wedded to market solutions. The fact that they've been forced to, absolutely had no choice but to get the state involved in supporting people, just like they bailed out the banks. They absolutely had no choice because of these very extraordinary circumstances. But I think that there will be an offensive to actually even further make inroads into employment rights once we start getting over the worst part of this crisis, and that we have to be very, very aware of that, and we need to keep that debate going. Try to have I want to see our unions having more of a vision of being far more radical than they have been, having a vision about the kind of society that we want. And it's not just about COVID, it's about the climate, because that's the juggernaut that's coming towards us. Once we deal with COVID, we've got this other major problem that we've got to cope with, and frankly our socio-economic system is not geared to combat that. So it's quite a broad brush kind of.
Yeah,
Fiona,
can I quickly jump in as well? But it's interesting because, I mean, picking up that point about will decent work become secondary, actually we know that sort of better quality work is twinned, no accident, with economic growth and productivity. That actually the evidence is that actually better quality work tends to sort of lead to better sort of productivity for nations. And so I think that supports the fact we shouldn't erode, COVID-19 shouldn't kind of lead to an erosion of work. Interestingly, if we look at the regions, sometimes I think the regions can lead the way where our national governments don't. Certainly in Greater Manchester, our mayor, we've got a good employment charter that they're developing, and a bit of a policy of it's a bit idealistic, but you have to have some ideals and hope of build back better, that actually really subsequent to this crisis actually is an opportunity to actually embed better infrastructure, and there's certainly an argument that if the public sector is funding or supporting private business to get back on feet, you know, to what extent do sort of businesses, for example, have good practice in terms of you know, their working context and so on. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of add a few points there, really. That I think we have to kind of, I think we have to hold on to the hope that kind of, you know, good work will remain, and as it actually is better for society, it's better for everybody.
We've probably got time for one more contribution. If anybody else wanted to ask a question, now is your opportunity. Please do raise your hand or unmute yourself and ask away. Okay, I can see everyone is pondering the many challenges that have emerged in our discussions this afternoon. And I think perhaps we'll call it a day at that point. We will be anticipating that our next few network events like this may well, seminars may well be virtual in this similar format. And do keep an eye on the NICEC website for more details, or our Eventbrite page. We'll be sending you more details. You should receive a survey about the event as well. So thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon. I hope you have enjoyed the session and the chance to have a chat in the different discussion groups and meet your colleagues and your fellow attendees. Thank you very much to our presenters, Fiona, Christina, Eileen and Pete, for their input. And thank you all for joining in and sharing your thoughts and your comments in the chat. We will be sharing the presentation, and there will be a recording of this as well, which we should be able to share with you too.
I would like to say
thank you, Michael, for
managing the Zoom for us.
You're very welcome. Look forward to seeing you on a future call, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.